Lecture number 17 for Western Civ 1. The Viking contributions to Western civilization. As a devotional text today, I'd have you think back on the Olivet Discourse of Jesus recorded in Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus' disciples asked him when the things that he had talking about would come about. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming of the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you'll be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn from the faith and betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved." There are bad times that are ahead for Christians. Jesus didn't just paint things all in a rosy picture, thinking about things of this world. There will be challenges living here and living out their faith. But he's gone to prepare a place for them where they'll be with him, and there's reason for confidence, even in spite of the challenges that come in this world. At various times, Christian people through the ages are going to think that, oh, surely the end is coming, with all the tumult that's going on in this world. We need to understand that that's normal in a fallen world that's unredeemed, that people fight against others, they seize what is other people's properties, and there's all kinds of conflict. But we can have a peace in the midst of all of that, because Jesus has won the great victory, and we have a home with him for sure. We have reason for confidence and a sense of security. But what we're going to find in today's lecture is that after the period of the Carolingian Empire, which had expanded across Europe, that people had come to think that things were fairly secure. But even during Charlemagne's reign, problems were brewing. They had been fighting a long series of wars against the Saxons, but as the Saxons were weakened, people further to the north had already begun to invade, and by 793 the island of Lindisfarne, where there's a famous monastery, was captured, and Charlemagne's advisor, Alcuin of York, would lament the destruction of that famous monastery and all of the literary resources that it had at the hands of Scandinavians that we know as the Vikings, and as the Danes. These would be Norsemen, people who came from the north, particularly using ships. So as we study these invaders into Europe, what are our sources of knowledge for them? Our sources that come from Scandinavia itself would be various Norse sagas. Some of these are preserved in Icelandic stories that are told. They're famous as a storytelling people. They would use runes later on, again their style of writing, but these typically are rather short texts, and so when you find inscriptions of runes, rune stones, these are usually short texts that might talk about a military activity, but they're not long epic stories or histories or anything like that. So most usually we're dependent upon their neighbors who were literary to record their history. So we will have accounts that we find in Western European chronicles. We'll also find sources in the East, amongst the Byzantines, and also amongst the Arabs, who write accounts of the coming of these, what they would perceive to be savages. Beyond these written accounts, we also have archaeology, where we can find their bones as the Vikings and other Norsemen buried their dead, sometimes with objects, sometimes with other people, as sometimes their jarls, their nobles, were buried with slaves who were executed to accompany them in service even into the afterlife. Sometimes their boats have been found in remarkable state of preservation, as they are discovered buried in anaerobic watery contexts, which have preserved them at a magnificent state of preservation. So we have a number of sources that give us insight, and again, people as they leave evidence of their activities. So where does these people come from? Well, we generally think of the Norse as coming from Scandinavia and being a Germanic people. They certainly had a long conflict with the Saxons, but they're going to come into contact with European civilization increasingly as Charlemagne defeats the Saxons. The Saxons are no longer holding a northern frontier against the expansion of the Scandinavians, and so they're going to move southward. And they're going to move, first of all, to places like Ireland and Scotland, and down into what we know today as England, as they expand in a westward direction. But at the same time as they're expanding westward, they're also expanding eastward down the long rivers that reach into what we know today as Russia, going down rivers like the Dnieper and the Volga River. And some of the peoples in that area were not terribly literate, and so as a result we don't have too much in the way of written accounts of their expansion eastward, but they most certainly were expanding eastward as well as westward. We have all kinds of notions about these. Sometimes, television portrayals, or maybe you watch the cartoons in the Sunday paper, and you might read Hagar the Horrible. Well, there's certainly some notions about the Vikings, and we'll see that they make significant contributions to Western civilization. Certainly, they have a great impact on European culture, but we don't have a whole lot of written sources of their history. But what we can reconstruct is that they do emerge in Scandinavia, and they're going to expand as they have military capacity to do so, and as the weather fluctuates and they're looking for places where they can farm that are more profitable, they're going to take their advantage and exploit them to their greatest extent. So they emerge in Scandinavia, but these peoples, as we look at their society, we find that they're certainly agrarian, but they also look towards the sea. This is seen in their diets, insofar as studies have made of these things, looking at ancient cesspits and looking at their bones. We'll find that they have varied degrees of nutrition, but certainly we're going to find they eat a fair amount of meat, and they're going to depend upon farming. They'll also depend upon looking to the sea, so there'll be food that comes from the sea in the way of fish that they add to their diet, and this will be providing them with proteins also. They grow grains where they can, and so these people are going to be fairly well nourished in comparison to some others, and certainly size will give them some advantage at times, not that every Viking is a large person. As we look at their society, we find that it's a socially stratified society with three classes. They had people that they knew as thralls, which would later be known as slaves. There were carls, these are the free people, and there were jarls, these would be nobles. And so this is a socially stratified society where freemen and nobles are particularly going to be enamored with warfare, and as we look at their religion, we'll find that they have a number of deities that they identify with astronomical phenomenon, the various planets in particular, and they'll share much of this in common with other Germanic people of Northern Europe, and like other Germanic people, we'll see that they certainly glorified war, and this will be the subject of many of their sagas, as they extol their military prowess in these things. As far as weaponry goes, they certainly had iron weaponry and were able to forge hardened blades, and their two-handed swords would be capable of penetrating certain defenses that other people had. As we think about their military prowess, one thing that you can dispense with is your notion of the Vikings, the Minnesota Vikings, with the cow horns on the sides of their helmet. You see that on the depictions of Hagar the Horrible also. Those seem to be particularly helmets that are used perhaps for religious purposes. They're not commonly found at all, and depictions of Vikings don't typically have those sorts of helmets on them. They certainly wouldn't have functioned well when you're operating in close proximity to each other in their longboats, and they would have gotten in the way in some of their activities. So we can dismiss with that idea to some degree. They certainly were effective military individuals. Some people think this is because they were drunk going into battle, or perhaps they used some other hallucinogenic agent that led them to a certain ferocity in battle, which gave them an advantage. But they had reason to want something more. With climatic fluctuations, they could get to warmer territories, and they found that they could dominate other people as a result. As far as their strategies, what we're going to find is that as they expand, they're certainly going to not just engage in pillage, but they also engage in trade. From up there in the north, they have particularly amber as something that was highly prized in certain circles for its properties and used as jewelry. They would also have furs and various textiles, particularly wool, that they would export. They would also have down from birds that they could pluck. And as they traded things, something else that they could trade were whetstones, salt, and some of their produce like cod coming from the sea. And as they were victorious, they would take lots of slaves captive, and particularly against the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. And this is the origins of our word slave, actually, is that you have Slavs who are taken into forced service. Perhaps most famous as far as the cultural contributions of the Vikings would be in the area of shipbuilding. Nautically, they developed a number of sailing techniques, and particularly their long ships. Their long ships are, again, they aren't all the same length. Some are longer than others, but these are made of wood. Their preferred wood would be oak, and they would learn to bend it in certain ways, letting it dry out slowly, sometimes underwater or in bogs. The wooden structures were typically made on a keel, so you have a large timber that would form the bottom of the boat, and then to that you would have overlapping boards that were riveted together, and they'd overlap each other, and those overlapped areas would be caulked with animal fibers like wool that are then soaked with pine tar, and thus they're able to create a boat that's fairly flexible and durable and able to resist the intrusion of water. And these boats are typically long and narrow and fairly light in construction. This is going to give them some advantage when they want to carry them. The shallow draft, these boats don't draw any more than about 3 feet of water. That would allow them to go up river estuaries, even up into creeks where the water's not so terribly deep. And if they encountered some obstacle, they could potentially lift the boats over the obstacles to where they could sail them once again. They're typically rowed with oars, and yet they could also have relief from that using a simple sail, using wool textiles. They made sails, fairly simple square sails that were sewn together, strips of wool cloth. As far as these boats go, they would oftentimes have the capacity to either go forwards and backwards without any problem. This would give them certain maneuverability, and we think about the prows of these ships, particularly having figureheads. Sometimes there are depictions of serpents or dragons. Perhaps these were to frighten away sea monsters, and certainly they would also serve as something to frighten their enemies. Sometimes the very large longboats get the name dragon boats, and they're going to use these to great effect. In steering these, they would use something known as a steerboard, and to accommodate for the drag this would put on the back of a ship. So they don't have rudders per se. They have a steerboard, and actually this is going to be something that's a contribution to Western society even today, as we think about nautical terminology. On the right side of the ship, you have the starboard side. That's coming from the word steerboard. The steering board was flat on the side towards the ship, and it was curved on the outside. This helped them to accommodate for the drag on the boat. And so you have a steerboard on the back right side of these ships. As far as where they know to direct themselves, they were familiar with the shadows cast by the sun. Certainly it would be a problem in cloudy days in the North Atlantic when they're sailing there or other places. But they had some simple tools that they could use that would give them some idea, and they're going to be intrepid sailors exploring the unknown and bringing back knowledge that they can share amongst their people. So they're going to be important in developing certain confidence in navigation and making discoveries, expanding their territory. Well, as we begin, we've said that they've glorified war, and that this people culturally are people who come from Northern Europe. Traditionally, they're pagan. What we'll find in time is that there'll be a conversion to Christianity through the efforts of British monks that will lead eventually to conversion. But as it starts off here, they are very much committed pagans who seek to resist the Christianization activities of people like Charlemagne, who would force his conquered enemies to convert or die. They're going to resist Christianity at first, and we're going to find that they attack monasteries and churches, and some of this will be because they are pagans, but the main reason will be because it's in churches and monasteries that you have movable wealth. You have things like those highly decorated treasure manuscripts that have these ornate jewel-encrusted covers, and you have altars where there's liturgical items like crosses and chalices made of gold, and these would be highly treasured, and so it's not surprising that they would plunder religious structures where wealth was concentrated. But again, as pagans, they were oftentimes led to believe that their gods were superior, and this is a way to demonstrate that. The Vikings and other Norsemen expand in different directions. Actually, the Norsemen who expand towards what we know as the British Isles are particularly the Danes early on. They would come from Denmark. Earlier, there had been another group of people that had come from that area, the Jutes. As we saw, the Angles and Saxons and Jutes had immigrated over into what we know as the British Isles. And by the time we get to the end of the 8th century, certainly the Danes are on the move. And at first they just come along the coast engaging in pillaging. And they find that the peoples in Ireland and Scotland and England are not politically unified and able to oppose them. Certainly in the area that's ruled by Charlemagne, they'd have a serious opposition. So they're going to go where there's less opposition, where people are somewhat divided, and as a result they're going to be able to pillage along the coast, and eventually they find that, hey, maybe we can settle down and these people can serve us in certain ways and we'll have advantages, and so they will establish what's known as Dane law. This is rather than just places where they come along and demand tribute and seize things. That was known as Dane Guild. They would eventually establish Dane law, where they settled and established political dominance in the places where they settled, particularly there in northeastern England. But they'll also settle in other places like western France, particularly once the Carolingian monarchs came to be weak. We'll find that the Norse will settle in France in the area known as Normandy. It's known as Normandy because that's where the Norsemen settled. Particularly important in the settlement of the Norse in Frankland will be their chieftain Rollo, who in the year 911 converted to Christianity and acknowledged his subjugation to Charles the Simple. As a result, he's going to rule over the area of Normandy. And we're going to find the Franks who intermarry with these Norsemen are going to play a very important role, and that these Norsemen here in France are going to be interested in continuing to expand along the coast of the Atlantic, down around the Iberian Peninsula and into the Mediterranean, where they're eventually going to capture the island of Sicily, and even push as far as intruding upon the city of Constantinople, and they'll pose something of a threat to the Byzantine Empire. So they've been expanding along the west side of Europe, but they've come up against the Carolinians, and so they're largely held off until the end of the reign of Louis the Pious. But shortly after the death of Louis the Pious, what we find is that they pitch up for church on Easter Sunday in Paris in the year 845, and they plunder the churches there. They'd been able to come a couple hundred miles up the Seine River because their shallow draft boats could be rowed against the fairly mild current, and so they pitched up for church to take an offering. And this would just be the beginning of the horrors that would shake Europe and the successors to Charlemagne, and eventually lead to the demise of some of these kingdoms that had been established following the Treaty of Verdun. The Norse also expanded eastward, going down those great rivers, expanding into what we know today as Russia. Russia gets its name from the local name that's given to these Norsemen, and that would be the Rus. The Rus in the east here appear to have adopted the local Slavic languages. Many times they would take many Slavs as slaves, as prisoners of war that they'd sell into slavery. They'd sell them back at home. They'd also sell them into slavery amongst the Muslims who they encountered. And they would actually make trade missions as far as Baghdad. The Eastern Norsemen here would eventually intermarry and establish their own territories, particularly around the city of Kiev. You have the Rus of Kiev that will later be led by their leader Vladimir, who reigned from 956 until 1015. Vladimir of Kiev made a great marriage alliance with Basil, the emperor of Byzantium, and would subsequently convert to Eastern Christianity, and Greek Orthodoxy would have a great deal of influence amongst these people who adopted the Cyrillic alphabet. Methodius and Cyril, two Byzantine monks, had a great deal of influence in taking the gospel here to peoples in this area, and they developed the Cyrillic script. This is why in Russian today you have the basic use of the Greek alphabet. Some of you might have along the way seen old shows that have Soviet athletes, maybe at Olympic Games, having the letters CCCP on their uniforms. What we need to understand is that's actually the letters SSSR. The C is a moon-shaped or lunate sigma, so that's actually an S. And so we have the Soviet Socialist republics here that are being identified by the SSSR. Again, the P, it makes an R sound in Greek. It's a rho and not a pi. So there is a P in Greek, but as a result, if you recognize Greek letters, you can sound your way through part of the Russian alphabet. So these people are intermarrying and integrating in various ways in both the East and the West, and they're disrupting societies that had existed there before, challenging them in a number of ways, establishing their own territories, and creating a sense of instability and anxiety. You just never know when the Vikings are going to come up your river and invade your town. People are looking for security. Sometimes they can make marriage alliances and make allowances to let people settle down, and they'll learn to live with a new normal. So the Vikings very much disrupt the status quo of Carolinian Europe, and this is going to have a dramatic effect. But as we move a little bit later on, we find that they go on expanding, and they expand westward. And in the 9th century, in the year 874, they'll discover Iceland, out far in the Atlantic, and they're going to settle Iceland. It's rather a formidable place, but for its north latitudes, it's actually quite warm as the Gulf Stream comes close by. But they're going to find this as something of a place from which they can engage in shipping and fishing, and a launching point from which they'll go further by the year 914 to discover Greenland. Now, as Greenland suggests, it was a little different at that point in time, as there had been some climatic variations, and they're going to be able to establish a colony on Greenland, and the first church there will be established around the year 1000, and the first bishop of Greenland is consecrated around the year 1126. And so there will be a population that lives in the southern part of Greenland. Some of these people who died there are now today found in frost as it's gotten colder over the years, and so something of their bones and bodies can be studied archaeologically. There's not a whole lot of written sources about them, but around the year 1000, moving on from Greenland, a person who was marginalized socially was Leif Erikson, who went on to explore further to the west. And he appears to have been a person who discovered the Americas. There's a famous map known as the Vinland map that appears to originate around this time, that shows on it Helluland, that would be Baffin Island, Markland, Labrador, and Vinland, Newfoundland. Now, it's not that there's any grapes that are there particularly for them to be harvesting, but in the 1960s, physical evidence of these settlements in the New World were found in Newfoundland, and so clearly there's evidence that the Vikings did cross the Atlantic. And this would be centuries before Christopher Columbus would sail in 1492. So they're intrepid explorers at sea, and fierce warriors on the land. Their boats, however, weren't designed for boat-to-boat conflict. Their boats are essentially transportation devices that bring their marines to places where they then will subsequently attack. The Vikings are going to play an interesting role across Europe, certainly in changing the political structure of things. The old Carolinian Empire is threatened. They're allowed to settle in Normandy. In the area of Sicily, the Norsemen will come in the year 1091, where they will conquer it from the Muslims. They'll also invade parts of Italy and create the Kingdom of Sicily, which is both the island of Sicily and the south part of Italy. And this will last for a couple hundred years. They'll push against the Byzantines, creating conflict in the Balkan Peninsula, where you have the country of Greece, but also pushing towards the walled city of Constantinople. And all their military excitement is going to promote a fragmentation of Europe. At times they will create their own empires. Particularly important will be the Scandinavian Empire of Canute. Canute comes from up here in Scandinavia, and in the years between 1016 and 1035, he's going to establish an empire which will include Scandinavian countries and England. But when he dies, again, his is an impressive little empire, but he's able to command some 1,200 longboats that help him to maintain his control, and yet when he dies, there'll be certainly an independence that takes place in Britain, but there's a question about who's going to rule. And so as a result, in the year 1066, we have a conflict, particularly as in England, Edward the Confessor, who had ruled as the English king between 1042 and 1066, died, and subsequently there was competition for who would be his successor. Representing Canute would be Harold of Norway, who had a claim, and he would be defeated by Harold of Wessex. Harold of Wessex was the choice of what's known as the Witan. This would be a group of tribal and clan leaders and small kingdoms in England. But Harold of Wessex was challenged by William of Normandy. He used 600 longboats to invade, and you have the famous battle that takes place in 1066. And as a result, William of Normandy, following the Battle of Hastings, will become the singular ruler of England. He'll become the King of England. He doesn't speak English. He's Norse. He essentially speaks Frankish at this point in time, French, and he'll become the Lord of England and will redistribute it amongst his warlords. And this is going to change England's history in significant ways. So these Norsemen have a great political impact on various people groups and a social impact. Particularly their social impact was that they create a great deal of uncertainty. They're going to bring a great deal to Western civilization. Some of that will be inherited from various places. Certainly they bring Germanic culture that we've talked about previously, and recall from that we have such things as names for our days of the week. We have a number of words in the English language that come, and not just English, it's other European languages that come from the Norsemen. And so, we have Monday, Moon Day, Tuesday, again, this is Tuesday, this would be a Germanic god, and then you have Odin's Day, Wednesday, Thor's Day, Freya's Day, Saturn's Day, and then Sunday. So the days of the week, again, are influenced by these Germanic gods who are identified with various planets, and those names will be stuck particularly amongst English-speaking people. What you'll find amongst some other Romance languages that aren't as influenced by Germanic languages as English is that they'll continue to use the old Roman names for gods and planets. And so in French, you'll have lundi, moon day, that still works. But then you have mercredi. This would be Mars Day, and this would be the equivalent of Twi. Twi is represented by Mars. And so there's interesting connections here that we can see in given the names of days of our week. But the Norse were not the only ones in the late 8th century, moving on to the 9th century, that caused great disruptions to European society, making people want peace and security, just longing for somebody to protect them, feeling terribly insecure. Another people group would be the Magyars. We don't know quite as much about the Magyars as we do the Norsemen. They are not a literate bunch. Again, we're going to know a little bit about them from those people that write about them. But they're going to emerge early on in the 9th century as they come to compete with the Bulgarians and the Byzantines. And they're a mobile group of people. Their tactic for fighting was that of riding on horseback. And when confronted with a large army, oftentimes they would retreat, enticing people to chase them. And then they could quickly turn upon those people who were chasing them. They're going to move across Europe over the next century, as they're going to come around the year 896 to invade the area of the Carpathian Plain in what we know today as Hungary. When faced by armies. The Franks would lead in armies around the year 900 against them. They would defeat the Franks and eventually push their way through Frankland all the way to the Atlantic coast by the year 926. And so people are very, very concerned. The heirs of Charlemagne are not protecting them from these incursions. You just never know when these horse-mounted warriors are going to come and pillage. And so people in Europe are going to be very much satisfied when Otto I conquers the Magyars, the Battle of Lechfeld, and pushes them into settling down in the area of the Carpathian Mountains and Carpathian Plain, the area we know today as Hungary. So the Magyars are the forebearers of the Hungarians today. But the major contribution that they bring to European history here and to Western societies, they created together with the Norsemen a sense of great insecurity. A third source of insecurity was continued Islamic pressure. At this point in time, the Muslims are often known as the Saracens. As the Saracens push northward, they're going to be confronted. Certainly, Charles Martel had conquered them at the Battle of Tours back in the year 732, but they'll continue to push, sometimes invading Italy, threatening Rome, and so they're adding to the general instability of the early 10th century in Europe. So it's not just in northern Europe, but it's all the way down in the Mediterranean. You're wondering, will the Vikings or the Norsemen come up your river? Will they come to Constantinople? The Byzantines have their challenge from these various sources also. But in Western Europe, there's something of a crisis, and people are looking to find somebody to protect them. They're looking to make a social arrangement by which they can have a greater sense of security. And in that context, we're going to find that the Norsemen and the Magyars and the ongoing pressure of the Saracens will create a new society in Europe that we'll know as medieval Europe. So this is a major thing that we have as a contribution coming out of these people from the Norse, and is that there's just a change that's going to happen in European society. This is going to be the major contribution that I see. There are certainly other small contributions that are made, and we see this preserved a lot in language, in European languages. Thank you for your attention today. So the Vikings had a great deal of impact, but what is it that brings about an end to their disruption? What brings about the demise of the Vikings as social disruptors? Certainly we're going to see that Europe is going to reorganize its society, but the Vikings stop pressing. Part of this is because they assimilate, they settle down and become part of the society of Europe. Part of it is going to be because they embrace Christianity, as these British monks are finally successful in converting Scandinavian leaders, and those Scandinavian cultural leaders lead the local communities to accept Christianity. They also accept Western forms of kings and create new kingdoms, and essentially settle down by adopting various European forms in their society. And the Vikings change as a people group as they're influenced by Christianity, and this is not saying that everybody immediately becomes a committed and practicing follower of the message of Jesus, but their society embraces what was in Europe and becomes a participant in it, and their exploits off to the west will eventually be forgotten, and some of the things that they discovered will have to be rediscovered, and it'll take some time for some of those things to be rediscovered, but certainly Iceland will continue to have contact with Scandinavian countries, and developments in seafaring are going to be particularly important in the subsequent development of Western civilization as people look to the sea and they're confident to go trading across the oceans out of the sight of land, developing the ability to navigate, and these Norsemen certainly are going to promote a certain amount of long-distance trade and cultural interchange in society.